Michael's going to go briefly with an announcement too.
Well, thank you so much for letting me do this, Susan. I'll just take a minute. I'm Katie Shilton. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland in College Park, and I'm a colleague of Susan's on the Trails project. But I'm here to talk about a slightly different project today, which I've also partnered with Susan on. We have a project called TAP, which is the Transatlantic Privacy Perceptions Project. And we do periodic surveys, quarterly surveys of data governance and privacy professionals. So folks like you to try to understand how things are changing in the field at the moment. And so we have a survey open right now that Susan was kind enough to let me promo that asks about AI and data governance. And so we would love increased participation. I'm going to put 2 links in the chat for you. The first is to our website, so you can see what we've done before. We have visualizations up of some of our previous data in case you're curious about how things are changing in the privacy and data governance space. And then here is a direct link to our Wave 6 survey, or the 6th survey that we've done. It will take 2 to 5 minutes. If you work in data or in privacy, you are eligible. Or if you even spend a lot of time sort of in your volunteer life, you don't have to be a privacy professional. You could also be somebody who's working with privacy or data in a non-professional capacity. We're interested in a broad set of perspectives. So if this is something you have 2 to 5 minutes to do, we would love your participation. It's an ongoing panel, so we will, if you give us permission, ask you periodically again. And it will always be quick, and we hope it will always be useful. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Okay, Michael also has an announcement.
Yes, I will just do a quick plug, just like Dr. Shilton. So I'm Mike Marino. I work with Dr. Susan Aronson with the Digital Trade Data Governance Hub, and we're working on our data governance metric. So quick little overview on this metric is we are looking to see if governments have or have not adopted following indicators that we've listed. These are yes or no, and we're looking to see the role of data governance may play in nurturing and sustaining AI. So you'll notice we are currently working on 4 case studies, PRC, EU, UK, and the US. Some of these indicators, if you went to our last webinar, the data assetization, that's one of the indicators that we're looking at. Only China has that so far. So basically, we're really looking, if you can take a couple of minutes, look at this, and just give us any general comments. Susan and I will be holding an office hours next week. We'll be also sending out an email to our mailing list. And lastly, I will throw in this Google form in the chat where you should be able to comment, leave comments directly in this, and we will get them and get back to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Okay, welcome everybody, and thanks for coming to today's webinar, which is focused on how the United States governs data and the implications for AI. We have 3 wonderful speakers. Our first speaker will be Coben Ziffel-Keegan, who wrote an article that was the motivation for this webinar. And he is well, you can see everybody's bio, so I won't take time because we're already late. Clara Langevin and Nick Marta. Clara's with the Federation of American Scientists. Oh, cat problems. And Nick Marta is with Mozilla. So why don't you go first, Coben, while I get my cat out of here.
I always appreciate a cat showing up in the webinar, so this is delightful to me. Thanks so much for having me, Professor Aronson. This has been great. I'm excited to chat with everybody. I will try to be relatively quick. I think she said 8 minutes, so I think I'll be right at that. As she said, my name is Coben Ziffel-Keegan. I work for IAPP, which is the Global Professional Association for Privacy, AI Governance, and Digital Responsibility. I am our managing director for the DC office, where I serve as a policy presence for the privacy profession, although we are policy neutral. So largely my role is one of amplifying and keeping track of the policy conversation in DC and around the United States. My background is I'm a privacy attorney, and consumer protection background by training, but I dabble in some of the other areas that we're going to talk about today, including trade policy and AI. I think Professor Aronson asked me to join this conversation because of, as she mentioned, some of my recent writing. quite a bit about digital trade recently, and kind of the growing signals of a shift from the historical focus that we have seen in the US, which unconditionally supported the free flow of data. My personal experience with that, with those issues of kind of data flows, started under the EU-US Privacy Shield framework. I used to work for BBB National Programs, which serves as one of the independent recourse mechanisms under the Privacy Shield. So as such, I saw firsthand the strong US advocacy to the EU and to other countries, but particularly for that framework to the EU against data localization requirements and any kind of data transfer restrictions, including those that we see under the GDPR. That approach, that general support for the free flow of data, or maybe with some asterisks like the free flow of data with trust or some accountability mechanisms and governance baked in, that's been the longstanding policy position of the US across a lot of presidential administrations going back for decades. But over the past few years, we've started to see some cracks in that. I'll just go through them one by one really quickly so that we have some framing here. The last administration, the U.S. trade representative caused a big stir in digital trade circles, and probably a lot of you know about this, when she softened the U.S. language that supported the free flow of data. And she pointed to critiques that some of the multilateral negotiated language that we've seen in prior trade agreements and such was simply another way of entrenching big tech power. That pivot didn't really flow to the rest of the US administration. And it kind of sparked a lot of internal debate, I think, within the administration. It never really quite resolved within the Biden administration, but it caused a lot of stir. More substantively on data flows, we're starting to see actual legal restrictions from the US, though they are targeted and narrow, at least in theory and at least mostly. So at the same time, everyone knows about the TikTok divestiture bill. People probably also know that Congress at that time passed a law that restricted the sharing of sensitive personal data with countries of concern like Russia and China and North Korea and Iran. That was it was a hastily drafted companion bill to the TikTok divestiture bill. But it's pretty straightforward. It's a very short bill. It's fully enforced now. The FTC can enforce violations of those data transfer restrictions about certain types of personal data. The Biden administration, not to be outdone, also crafted a major executive order that has very similar goals to the congressional, to the act of Congress, that protects the bulk sensitive data of Americans. Lots of concerns around data brokers and such, especially when foreign adversaries can purchase information about Americans on the open market. And also military personnel, government workers. It doesn't even have to be bulk to be part of the restrictions there. The Department of Justice took that executive order and turned it into a very lengthy and complicated set of rules, which actually just went into force this week on Tuesday. So we could do a whole webinar just about those rules, so I won't talk about the substance of them. I like to say that it takes at least 3 people locked in a room all day to come close to understanding the legal significance of those regulations. We call them the data security rule for some reason. It is very security focused, but I think it takes a privacy lawyer, a trade lawyer, and a national security lawyer all together to kind of unpack the different legal lenses that the rule is using all at once. On the bigger picture, I've been frequently pointing to kind of what these developments mean for US policy moving forward, now that there are cracks in that veneer of the kind of consistent free flows approach. They open the way to further erosion of that type of policy. As I said at the beginning, IAPP is policy neutral. So, and in this case, I find it hard to decide, I think, in a rapidly shifting world, whether this change in policy is good or bad. We're living in a different reality, but it is certainly a change from what has been the consistent US approach before. I'll close by talking even more about even more recent developments. Today in my column, I wrote about the new administration and the current focus on what everyone's talking about, the total reset of the global trade conversation, and what that could mean for digital trade. I was trying to point to a few areas where the administration is highlighting data transfer restrictions as non-tariff barriers to trade, including in a bunch of countries, especially the EU, but also China, Egypt, India, Israel, Kenya, Korea, Pakistan, Peru, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Uruguay, the United Arab Emirates. All of those countries are called out in the most recent US Trade Rep report, which was released a week ago, on foreign trade barriers. That's the report that President Trump was brandishing when he was announcing the reciprocal trade tariff regime. And when you dig into it, that report really does have a lot to say about data flows and non-tariff, and calling them non-tariff, calling data flow restrictions non-tariff barriers to trade, which is not entirely new for that report, which has been around for 40 years, but it's a bigger emphasis than we've seen before, I think. We also are seeing rhetoric from Peter Navarro, the president's top trade advisor, about the importance of non-tariff barriers to their overall strategy in this strategy that we see. He had a recent op-ed in the Financial Times where he said that even worse than tariffs are the, quote, barrage of non-tariff weapons foreign nations use to strangle American exports, unfairly boost their shipments to the US, and wall off their own markets. Among kind of a long list of non-tariff barriers that he mentioned, he talked about data localization. He talked about the use of lawfare in places like the EU to target America's largest tech firms, quote unquote. And then yesterday, he was quoted in Newsweek after the pause in tariffs, framing it as a negotiation tactic. And I thought it was pretty notable that he actually zeroed in again and on kind of what this means for this policy trend. He said what our trading partners, are going to have to do without fail is they're going to have to lower their non-tariff barriers, because those are the bigger ones than the tariff barriers. So it seems like this administration is very focused on those writ large, which may include some of the data transfer and data, other kinds of e-commerce related restrictions. So anyway, in closing, my ongoing provocation, I guess, is to ask whether with the door open on data flow restrictions in the US, whether this administration might find this to serve as another lever for reciprocity or another point of negotiation leverage. I think the rest of our conversation is going to focus a lot on AI policy generally. So it's worth noting, of course, that AI systems rely on a lot of data, including personal data. And so these same classical data flow conversations that we've been having for many years are not going to go away in the age of AI. And arguably, I guess the stakes are even higher. So I will leave it at that. And I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else and the questions later.
Okay, thank you, Coben. Clara.
Right, thank you, Susan. Since you've introduced me before, I won't waste time talking about myself, but I'm an AI policy specialist at the Federation of American Scientists. I have a career going back and forth between the US and Brazil. I used to be a part of the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution Brazil, which is an affiliate center of the World Economic Forum. And with working in both US and Brazilian policy, I find that the idea of a data governance strategy for a federal government is fascinating. I personally focus on how governments look at the adoption of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies and what they can do to both bolster that, but ensure that that's being rolled out in a safe and equitable way. I think with one of my personal experiences working in Brazil is that I found that the confusion around data privacy, data protection was really tough for public sector servants or civil servants to understand. Brazil has a data protection legislation, and it's not to say that that data protection legislation is restrictive, but it was sometimes hard to understand what were the processes, the check-ins, the assurance points that civil servants needed to understand in order to adopt these technologies. So a lot of the work that I did in Brazil with the federal government and with several state governments was to understand how can we ensure guidelines on how to use on how to procure artificial intelligence that include considerations for data protection or include sectoral regulations that would inform how data would be used in that specific AI project. And I think that that's a concern that we see translated in the United States as well. Both the Biden administration, now the Trump administration with its OMB guidance from last week, have talked about how data governance is important for AI adoption within the federal government. There are considerations in both pieces of guidance, both OMB M2410 from the Biden administration and now OMB M2521 from the Trump administration about trying to share data to foster innovation within the public sector, within the federal government, within agencies. So looking at ways that agencies can share data between one another or can share AI tools or look at just general data governance practices to ensure that there's public trust in the way that data is being used by the federal government to adopt artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. Now, that's not to say that there is a huge strategy, even though these two pieces of guidance and several other, I guess, kind of piecemeal guidances around the two administrations have talked about data governance, especially within the context of adoption and research and development for artificial intelligence. But we have seen a few, I guess, starts. So, for example, last year, the Biden administration had a request for information on the use of commercially available information that may contain personally identifiable information. And that was, I think, a moment that brought together various different actors from civil society, from academia, from industry to talk about what a data governance strategy among all federal agencies should look like, since the federal government is the largest contractor of a commercially available information. And that is something that is not governed by the Privacy Act of 1974, which talks about how the government should treat personally identifiable information within its operations. And so looking at the different ways that, I guess, that data is used within the federal government, be it the way that it contracts data or collects itself, is something that we haven't seen being done to a larger scale in terms of governance. We do see some, I guess, like there are a few starts. So for example, in Congress, Representative Lori Trahan is looking at how to update the Privacy Act for the new age of AI. She's just put out a request for information that's going to talk about that and looking at ways that she can update that legislation. But we really haven't seen ways to govern the use of data in a widespread way that affects every single agency yet, especially in the age of artificial intelligence. Now, on the other hand, is looking at how the government can foster research and development of AI technologies, both within itself, but also in ways that engages with the external ecosystem of industry and other types of third-party researchers. So there are a few different projects that I think are really interesting. The first is the Department of Commerce's project on open data assets. They put out a request for information last year that was looking at ways that they could share their open data assets, so looking specifically at data from the US Census, to external researchers in a way that was safe, but was also to be used in a way that was good for creating foundation models. They recently published their guidelines on that this January, and it looks at ways of like using these government data to train foundation models, to test ways of secure safeguards. I think it's something that is really interesting that they put out there, but again, it's just one agency within the entire federal ecosystem. We do see other agencies such as the Department of Defense's Project FAST, which is Frontiers in AI Safety, Security, and Technology, which has been pretty interesting as well. It hasn't started yet. It's something that they're beginning to launch, but it would have a component that would look at the different types of data assets that are attached to the 16 national AI labs. You also have NAIRR, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later, which is the National AI Research Resource, which does have a secure data component that would democratize access to data, especially to third-party researchers. But so those are some of the ways that I think we see several different initiatives that would construct a greater national data strategy, but there is yet to be like an entire, I guess, like an executive order or something that would really put those all together.
Thank you, Clara. Nick?
Thank you. Good to be here. Quick background about myself. I'm Nick Marta. I'm currently the technical lead for AI governance at Mozilla. Before this, I was at the White House in the Biden-Harris administration, where I was chief of staff of the tech division at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So broadly, our team there worked on AI policy, data policy, and a whole bunch of other related tech topics, broadband and spectrum, digital accessibility, et cetera. And so have been around some of these issues, especially in the Biden administration, but a lot of the work we did there, of course, was building on the past few administrations before that on data policy and on tech policy broadly. So the way I want to give you a little bit of a framing here is to try to zoom out a little and situate the current context on data uh, in an AI discussion in sort of the broader frame of what I've seen happen on data policy over the last decade or so. And so you've heard a lot of really good details about the current landscape of a data strategy in the US and or the lack thereof. And I want to try to give this in a little bit of the context of how I think we've gotten here and what that means going forward. So if we back up to the Obama administration, the general gist on data strategy for the United States was one of open data. The emphasis was on making data available to the public, to researchers, to stakeholders, to companies, to be able to both do things with that data, but to also be able to bring greater transparency to the federal government. You have to remember in 2008, a large part of how tech was being talked about in that point was one about better engagement with the public, right? This was when social media was really coming to the fore. It was viewed as this way to like increase engagement between government and its constituents. And then also this was right after the Iraq War and a campaign against that. And a large part of that was about increasing transparency in government. And so open data was viewed as this lever that could be pulled to help increase transparency in government. So you saw this focus in a large chunk of the Obama administration on open data and on open government. You saw the Open Government Partnership come to fruition, which still exists, and this continued work to try to make data sets across the federal government more accessible and more open to the public. That work generally continued after the Obama administration. Different people have different assessments about how successful that was in the first Trump administration and in the Biden administration. But a key shift that happened, especially on the left here, is that from then till the Biden administration, you started to see a much greater focus on equitable data. The idea that it wasn't just about making data open, but that we should be using data to inform how policy is shaped and how programs are administered. And also that we should be trying to help society, including companies, be able to use data in similar ways as well. So you see a lot of efforts in the last administration focused on using that data in particular ways. You see a lot of reports, analysis, policy that embeds this concept of equitable data. For example, trying to disaggregate data so you have more information about the different demographics represented in a data set so that you can then use that to inform policy so that it equitably serves everyone. You also start to see more of an emphasis on trying to break data silos, barriers, et cetera, across the federal government to help improve performance on programs like that. And you start to see this broader discussion across society of like how we can use data to improve outcomes and not just make data more accessible to key stakeholders. The last shift I want to talk about, though, and this is where it comes to the sort of AI relevant perspective and a place where I think it's fair to say that we don't have as good of a strategy and we need to do more holistically on it, is a shift from these perspectives into one around AI enabling data. So you start to see bits over the last couple of years of government agencies and regulators starting to focus on what does it mean to think about data in the context of AI, making it easier to extract insights from data, so creating a whole bunch of new privacy concerns there. But also on the flip side, the type of data you need to be able to use AI to do helpful analyses, both to improve programs, but also just broadly to gain insight about the world. that's a different set of data in many cases. And you need to do different things to make that data usable. And so you start to see some of these shifts in US policy in the last couple of years. So for example, you see, as Clara was mentioning earlier, in the OMB guidance on government use of AI, you see this emphasis on trying to make the underlying data available and open, right? And there, yes, that's open data, sure. But the interesting part in this context is you're trying to make the data used to train AI models more open. And so that's AI enabling data that you're trying to make a bigger part of the ecosystem. You start to also see an emphasis on privacy enhancing technologies over the last couple of years for data sharing, right? Another spot where that's really important for enabling AI training on more sensitive data. And so that all is starting to move in a direction. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens in this administration. I think where you start to see a big gap, though, in this approach is that a lot of the work around data across the government, across policy, has been focused on making existing data more available and making data just broadly be used more responsibly. And that really misses an opportunity to make data to collect and use and make available data that is specifically tailored for AI applications. So I'll give you one particular example. At Mozilla, we have this project called Common Voice, which collects spoken voice data from folks around the world and creates a database where we have all of this spoken language data from over 100 languages around the world that you can then use to build an AI model on top of, right? So you can train your AI model on top of these data sets that are on all of these different languages. And many of those languages are underserved, right? The key driving premise for this project is to collect language data for languages that are often not represented in AI systems. And so this is the type of project that wouldn't have made that much sense to have pursued, say, a decade ago. Because like, why are you collecting all of this language data? Like, what's the use there, right? But now it's an extremely important project in an AI-enabled world because you need this data to be able to build AI systems that work in many more languages and work around the world. And so that sort of data collection project for a societal goal that is also not that commercially incentivized because these aren't large markets we're talking about with a lot of these languages. Like that's the type of problem that you need policy and nonprofits and all of these other sort of non-commercial actors to pursue in an AI-enabled world. And that's the type of data project that I feel like is particularly not being emphasized right now. And so that's where when I think about like where is data strategy really lacking, it's in creating and incentivizing this set of data that we need to actually have a robust, good, healthy AI ecosystem. So I'll wrap there. Excited to get into Q&A here and unpack a lot of what all three of us were talking about.
Okay, thank you so much, our three speakers. A couple of things I want to say. We only have one question in the Q&A, and I don't want to be asking all the questions, so please put your questions in the Q&A. Before we start to answer that first question, I just want to hint to you all that it takes a mighty sophisticated governance capability to achieve these goals: equitable data, accessible data, openness, security, integrity, protecting human rights, protecting privacy, data sharing, data accuracy, representative, free flow, and then, of course, digital trade barriers. I don't really see policymakers right now asking those questions and trying to come up with a strategy to address it. But let's get into your questions. And again, we're here, our speakers are here to answer them. So the first question is, are there any efforts folks know about to advise Congress on developing data governance policy with Congress to modernize agency governance infrastructure? Can anybody answer that one? Nick, is that one you could talk about?
No, I think my co-panelists might be a little bit closer to the hill here, but I don't want to put them on the spot either.
Agency governance, I mean, one effort that comes to mind is I'm trying to remember which legislator is leading on it. I think it might be Trahan. There's an effort currently underway to seek comments to modernize the Privacy Act of 1974, which is the governance for the governance structure for personal data in the federal government. And has obviously been subject to recent debate for a variety of reasons based on administrative actions. And so I think there's an open comment period for that, and I will find the link and put it in the chat in a moment.
Thank you, Coben. Clara, did you want to say anything?
I think I'll put the Trahan RFI in the chat as well. I think in terms of infrastructure, I'm unsure of anything currently. Now, in terms of like general data privacy, I think there's obviously been a few in the past year on privacy in general, outside of this context of like the Privacy Act of 1974, which is just for the federal government. And I think that there is a little bit of a complication because obviously you have other interests, but because you have like industry interests, civil society interests, but because many states have already passed their own data protection legislation, so you have California, you have Virginia that are very different. When you talk about like general privacy, there is a bit of this complication of understanding like is a certain element worth state preemption, because if we do pass a general privacy legislation, then that means that that will preempt legislation such as California. So a lot of civil society organizations, when they're looking at privacy legislation that could come this Congress and that wasn't passed the previous Congress, there is that gamble of like, okay, what are the elements within this privacy bill? Is there stuff on data minimization? What are the considerations on artificial intelligence? What are the considerations on civil rights? And are those strong enough to pass this bill that would preempt some effective bills that are currently being enacted in states?
Thank you, Clara. Okay, again, please, we only have one more open question in the Q&A. Please don't be shy. We're here to discuss these things, so we really want to hear your concerns and questions. Okay, the next question is, it sounds like there's a tension between the desire for technological growth and innovation and the desire to protect privacy, protect data from hostile nation states, et cetera, and perhaps even the desire to freeze the economic dominance of the tech sector. So do you see this tension in the current administration's policies, and how do you think this will be resolved? Clearly see it in the EU, given what they're doing. Anybody want to answer this question?
So to make sure I heard it right, the tension between sort of tech dominance versus the implications for society from that?
No, it's three different things, right? There's the tech dominance, but laying that on top of the stimulating innovation while protecting privacy. And, you know, the tech dominance comes from having a lot of the access to data, as well as, you know, you want to make sure that hostile nation states can't get that data. So how do you reconcile these? I mean, that was the point that I was trying to make with all those words that I heard. How do you reconcile these goals that appear to be conflicting when you have an administration that is restricting access to data? How do you do it?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in on that, I guess, just briefly. I think that is certainly a classic tension for privacy and for other digital governance domains, I guess, where we're saying, yeah, you have to, many people will argue for the kind of, yeah, maybe total open access to all information is the best way to innovate, or the fastest way to reach innovative goals, I guess. But people don't just want to, and I think the overall, there's always a balance there of innovation just for innovation's sake, and innovation that actually meets the ends that that serve society, right? And so that's partially the role of the people who implement privacy safeguards or AI governance safeguards or other governance structures within organizations, is to take externalities and bring them to bear on determining how open data should be, what should be shared, and what should be private, and kind of the structures that determine that. So I don't see that as a new challenge, but it is certainly an ongoing challenge, and it's made more difficult in an administration that is still figuring out, I think, what its specific policy positions are on, for example, AI governance, where we certainly see a focus on innovation and a lack of guardrails, but still an acknowledgement that there's a lot of underlying work that has to be done, and that many times kind of implicit recognition of some of the governance structures that are already developing. And I think Clara's point about the OMB guidance highlights that, where we see some major changes from the Biden administration's OMB guidance for AI governance in federal agencies, but also a lot of consistency, including the need for chief AI officers in agencies, and some of the same kind of structures for determining how you regulate, how you decide which systems should ingest different kinds of information and stuff like that. I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that's my response.
One point onto that too, which is that I don't think we have to assume that it has to lead to something cohesive. I think remembering that policy and policymakers aren't a monolith is going to be really important in this administration in particular. You're going to have a lot of different priorities and initiatives across the administration, leaders with different views that will be inconsistent with each other. And so you might end up seeing an approach where, like, take the OMB guidance, for example, which I think is generally like trying to grapple with these tensions, even though there's spots where I think we could argue it's challenging. While at the same time you hear rhetoric from other folks that is much more just like all data all the time. And then at the same time, like, I wouldn't be surprised if you hear some regulators, for example, even in this administration, talk more about the privacy concerns, in part because that's within their mandate. They're supposed to be working on that. And so you might still get this disconcerted effort. And I think it's worth looking more cohesively at what's happening in different sectors, in different areas regulated by or governed by different entities, both at the federal level and at the state and local level, because you might not get the same approach around health data as you might get around, say, construction data, right? Like, you can get very different orientations toward different sectors when there isn't going to be this like overarching mandate to think about data in the same way across the federal government, and you have a lot of different actors in a loose coalition who like all generally agree, but like in practice don't actually.
Thank you for that. Okay, so the next question is, given the accepted inclusion of data compliance and data quality as key elements of any data governance plan, do you feel as though data governance is the correct term to use? I'm not sure I understand that question, so MH, if you want to add anything more, but I'd be curious to know why you don't think those things are data governance. Is data governance the correct term to use, panelists? Does it matter what it is? Any comments?
I don't use that term very often in the broad sense because I think it is somewhat imprecise, although there is a field that calls itself data governance that I'm not exactly an expert in. It's more about the operationalization piece. Yeah, I'm a privacy guy, so I'm always talking about personal data. And then I'm also talking about AI governance, which is beyond data governance. So I think there's different layers of governance, right? But many similar mechanisms that are in there. Yeah, I think some of these terms are often imprecise in various ways.
The only thing is, like, if we let one technology, AI, overarch, let me recalibrate. Data is the foundation of a growing number of sectors, whether it's neurobiology, neurotechnology, XR, et cetera. And I'm worried that we might, following along the lines of what you just said, if this is about AI governance, we might have to recalibrate it, because the kind of metrics in XR, as example, eye blinks, blood pressure, heartbeat, those kind of things are all going to be, they're all personal data that may need new kinds of governance. Obviously IoT data is much broader set of personal data that, if linked together, could make data governance insurmountable. But why isn't data governance a good term? That's where I'm a little lost here. I'd love the questioner to add to this.
I feel like I would agree with Coburn that it is imprecise, where it is kind of just like a general of like umbrella term for a bunch of different things. And I do find, for me at least, like the taxonomy of like this data space is fascinating. Coming from Brazil, when we would talk about certain protections, we would talk about data protection. And then when I came to the United States, I saw that folks were using privacy, and I was trying to understand what exactly is the change between, because it seems like everybody was referring to like the same kind of policies, but here in the US it's privacy, whereas in other countries it's protection.
I will add one comment kind of in defense of governance here. It's not really in defense of that particular word, but a frame that is useful here, which is the thing I like about governance is that it's not regulation, for example, or it's not law or something like that, which over-indexes, I think, too much on concrete binding regulation or rules or policy. And I think what we care about more, or at least what I care about more, is that data is actually both used responsibly and made available in ways that enable good things to happen, right? It is about what actually is done with the data in the sort of broader context of the world. It's not necessarily that there are laws and regulations that force that to happen. I care more about the outcome here than I do about the process. And I think governance is a frame that lets you care more about the outcome. And it is also inclusive of work within companies to you know, do the right thing with data in a world where there might not actually be rules that you need to follow. So in an American context in particular, right, if you're not bound by sort of the same regulatory framework as you are in the EU, governance, I think, is a more inclusive term too, to say like, look, even if there aren't laws that compel you to do something, you still should be thinking about the governance of your data and the outcomes a little bit better. But I think all these terms are sort of squishy. And so like, it really is just like, what are the concrete set of things you care about? And like, let's put some wrapper around it with some word, and that's fine, as long as we like agree that the things that need to be in scope are in scope.
Thank you. Here is a question for you. Well, for everyone, but it's kind of focused on something you said. Could collecting data that is not commercially incentivized, such as the Common Voice example, be seen as putting vulnerable populations further at risk? If so, what are the steps around crafting governance, communicating, implementing, sharing the data to protect those populations? Do you want to give that a try?
Yeah, it's a thorny question, and there are people at Mozilla who have thought a lot about this, and I don't want to do them a disservice by incorrectly summarizing it, but I will tell you some of the core tenets of, more broadly, when you think about, collecting somewhat sensitive data from folks, like how do you think about using that responsibly? And I think a very integral part of that is bringing the community along with you as you do it. So I think a lot of these data collection efforts, including, ones that come with noble missions, end up being kind of paternalistic. It's sort of like, we're gonna take your data and then like, yeah, we're gonna enable good things and like, hopefully those help you. And I think that orientation just starts in the wrong place. And so a lot of efforts, Common Voice included, try really, really hard to actually do it with the community. There's a lot of engagement from the very beginning, even before you start collecting any data, to say we're going to design a process where we're working together to make these benefits actually redound to your community. and that we're building data and systems that like you all will be using as well, right? This is not something where you're building these data sets for others to go do something and then come back, right? So this sort of co-creation and co-governance process is sort of the frame I view a lot of initiatives like this as being really, really important. And then there are a lot of sort of concrete practices in between, right? A lot of things you can do, for example, to preserve the privacy in every specific data point in there, and to like try to reduce the risk of re-identification in data sets where that matters. There are pieces like that, layers that you can add on at every step that I think both on the margin are improving the responsible use. And then as part of that broader frame, you're actually like collecting and using data for purposes that are responsible. So I get the, some of the pieces there are sort of intentionally vague because it's going to vary from project to project. But on Common Voice, we have a couple of examples on the Common Voice page on Mozilla that go into a little bit more depth on how we engage the community and why it really matters to do that.
Thanks. Any other comments? Okay. The New York Times recently wrote that DOGE is consolidating databases of US government agencies allowing profilings of people, and the EU is thus reconsidering the Privacy Shield. Will we face a data war besides the trade war? Does anyone, I know that Congress is looking into this consolidation of data sets. Can anyone comment on that?
I can comment on part of your
Okay.
will we see a data war? That's a cool word. I don't know if I think it could mean a variety of different things. But the Privacy Shield is subject currently to legal challenges in the EU on both administrative and substantive grounds, unrelated to DOGE or the other actions of the administration, including firing independent oversight bodies and FTC commissioners and all of those things, which the EU has raised eyebrows very aggressively about. So I think we are likely to see the fall of the data privacy framework without that, with or without those additional efforts. I think one big question is what is this administration's reaction when that probably happens in the next months to a year. It's a very different landscape when suddenly that negotiated framework is no longer there. I'm not sure how that will play out. That will certainly be it won't smooth over the relationship that's already rocky between the two bodies.
Anyone else want to comment? Okay. Building on what Nick said about multilingual data and the need for policy and nonprofit involvement, what do you think are the biggest gaps in international frameworks or incentives governments could implement when it comes to building inclusive, secure, and interoperable data ecosystems for AI training, right? That's international.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have this concept we've been articulating at Mozilla called public AI. And it's this idea that public institutions, governments, nonprofits, philanthropies, and even corporations in some particular contexts should be investing in the infrastructure for AI at all parts of the stack that the commercial AI ecosystem doesn't incentivize. And so the idea basically is that right now you see all of this quote unquote progress in the AI ecosystem, but it's all being driven in ways that are generally commercially viable, right? Even some of the more R&D oriented aspects of what's happening in companies are in the end still being driven toward things that can eventually turn into products that are services that can generate revenue. That makes sense. That's how the ecosystem and the economy generally operates. But what we've seen time and time again with many technologies in the past is that you need an alternative incentive model to coexist side by side with what's happening in the economy to incentivize the use of that technology for other applications or for other users that simply aren't going to be able to participate in the market-driven structure. And so, for example, there are very simple examples here, like, you're on the road and you have cars and buses, right? There are different ways to get from one place to another based on your needs, how much you're able to pay, etc. Or a more, tech-driven example, you turn on the TV and you have both, commercial networks, say NBC, and you also have public broadcasting like PBS. And so this idea basically, right, like you can try to create this alternative ecosystem that coexists is sort of the frame we're operating in here. And I think to apply it to this question, I think this is where you see one of the really important reasons why you need governments to step in to help incentivize that alternative structure. So take Common Voice, for example, right? Like this is something companies aren't super incentivized to do because a lot of the markets that these languages would serve are very small. And so a nonprofit like Mozilla can show up and say, hey, we're going to help fill this gap. And sure, the data that comes out of this isn't going to necessarily like generate a lot of profits, but it creates a lot of societal value. And we can do this on the margin, right? Like we can show up and do this for this one particular use case, but there are so many examples like this across the ecosystem. And to have this happen at scale, you actually need public support, financing, and resourcing, the type that governments can provide. So I would love to see, for example, the UK step in and say, hey, we're going to try to put a lot of money and talent and resources behind some sort of national initiative to help create the data and maintain the data needed to train these AI applications that aren't necessarily commercially viable. Or we're going to, for example, try to take data that government is uniquely poised to be able to collect and open up that is AI relevant, and we're going to make that happen. And so I think that is an opportunity for a lot of governments. And I'll add one more bit that in the UK and in the EU, there's this sort of broader debate happening around like geopolitics, around basically, look, the US is kind of going off and doing its own thing, and China is China. What does Europe do to try to sort of assert some role in the AI innovation ecosystem? And I think there's an opportunity for Europe to lean in a little bit more on some of these public interest applications and in other ways of building AI, for example, open source AI, that can give Europe a comparative advantage in different types of AI. So it doesn't mean that they have to be building, the most capable frontier models, but rather they are building an AI ecosystem that is really good at like certain public interest applications and is drawing in talent to Europe because they're, pushing on certain really interesting problems that are important for the world. So I think there's really an opportunity for leadership here as well.
Okay, any other comments on that? Can the speakers stay for 5 more minutes so we can answer all these questions? Okay, a couple of things I just want to say, we've talked about data quality, we've talked about data sharing, we've talked about data protection. All these are things that data governance is supposed to do. If that interests you, I would be so grateful if you would comment on our metric of data governance, because we're trying to figure that out here at the hub. What is data governance? And so we would really benefit from your feedback on it, and you can see it up above in the comments. One thing we have not talked about is transparency in terms of how companies get their data. And obviously there's the data provenance requirements in the EU Act for high-risk systems. So there's sort of an incentive for data transparency, but at the same time, there's all these court cases regarding OpenAI and others in terms of stealing copyright or protected data. So we have this tension here. What kinds of transparency governance would help to achieve the goals of you need the transparency so data can be priced right? Because it's like corruption. The market is opaque. And how are you going to build counterweights to problems if you can't regulate that market? Any thoughts? Okay.
Something
Good.
we that I've written about a little bit in terms of commercially available information within the context of its use by the federal government is to find ways of creating authorization frameworks. So something that I've published in the past is creating kind of a FedRAMP system for commercially available data sets that would have considerations for data provenance. And right now, FedRAMP is a system that authorizes cloud services, and the Biden administration had a project to make it to have a FedRAMP authorization for AI systems, especially commercially available off-the-shelf systems. And then one of our recommendations to the Biden administration was to do the same thing for commercially available information. Now with the current administration, I'm not sure. I think a lot of the concerns about commercially available information are going to continue, especially if there is an update to the Privacy Act, where the fact that the current Privacy Act doesn't talk about commercially available information and how it's used by the federal government, especially if it has personally identifiable information, that could be a way forward within this ecosystem of the federal government. And of course, this authorization would have context on how the data was collected, who is the owner of this data, how does that relate to internal processes of the federal government, what were the consent mechanisms, and things like that.
Thank you. Okay, so let's keep going. As the U.S. begins regulating outbound data flows under national security justifications, how can we create a framework that protects democratic values and fosters responsible innovation without isolating the United States? Coben, do you want to give that a try?
Sure, yeah, and I think it's a good opportunity to pour cold water on my overall point, which is to say that I don't think we know for sure that the US is going to do that. We do have some sort of we're dipping our toe in the idea of restricting data flows, where we actually frame it as restricting access to sensitive data, which I think actually makes more sense than talking about data flows, because that's more kind of technically accurate way of thinking about it, whether someone's accessing data. But I don't know for a fact whether that will expand or whether national security justifications might be broadened to incorporate additional countries, for example, or a different, more broader set of personal data. Those DOJ, the way this DOJ rule is structured, it kicks in at different volumes of personal data given different sensitivities. And that could be restructured if it wanted to be. So yeah, I think protecting democratic values is an important aspect of continuing to kind of think through these issues on the global stage and within individual countries. Probably relying only on executive orders is not always the best way to incorporate the kind of democratic process. And so it could be that Congress could turn to some of these issues as well. I think it would require a lot of analysis to think through kind of what the scope of executive authority is on some of overall on some of these data flows issues, because the US has not historically tried to impose a lot of this. And so this is kind of a new field in many ways.
Any other comments? It is such a new field. Does anyone want to talk about data trust or similar data collaborative models that could address data governance at scale? Okay. Someone asked about state level data governance, but I think that's going to take a ton of time. So I just want to ask you if you would like to make any final comments, each of you. Clara, do you want to go first?
Sure, and I think information on state governance or state data governance is forthcoming. That's something that we're looking into, especially within the confines of how governments procure and adopt artificial intelligence, since that will be a huge part of it. But I think this was a great conversation. I see that there's so many different elements that we were all able to cover, and so many great questions, especially on things that like data trust that I definitely need to read up on. So I'm very happy to be here, and this was a really great conversation.
Thank you, Clara. Coben?
Sure. Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I think I kind of included some of what I wanted to wrap with in my last comment, but yeah, I echo Clara. This was a great conversation, and I'm glad to be a part of it. I think, yeah, from my perspective, one of the things that we're always the framing that we always approach this with from IAPP, because we are a professional association, is to think about the people who are doing the work of this. This is all it. There's people implementing data governance processes across organizations around the world, whether they are privacy professionals or brand themselves in other ways. That's one way that we've established these robust principles-based kind of practices in the US and beyond, is because we have this vibrant profession where we are constantly reflecting the state of the art. And so hopefully that can continue to serve in the future. That's an important mechanism towards how we adapt moving forward.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, just echoing what was said. Grateful to be here. This was a really great conversation. I think the one bit I would wrap with is, as we talk about a data strategy in the context of AI, getting specific about why that matters and what's different with AI and its implications for data feels really important. And I think we have to increasingly go beyond just the idea of like we should make data open or we should make it more private. And we have to be able to add a little more nuance like we were just doing here, I think, to say, for example, like here's the actual goal we have in the world that we want to use AI for. How is data a part of getting there? And so I think starting a little bit more with what is the outcome we're trying to get in the world, I think is increasingly important for the type of tech we're talking about. And I would love to see data strategy move in that direction and think about what needs to be done to enable those outcomes.
Thank you. I just want to add one thing. I'm thinking, of course, because this is the substance of the Hub's research. I really like the idea of outcomes. My problem with that is that the same set of data could have a public good outcome, it could have a commercial outcome, it could be rife with personal data that, has 67 different approaches to governing it. This is so complex. It's hard to come up with one thing. And it's so AI oriented right now. Is that the right way to go? I hope we will all question it, because data governance is so much harder than, let's say, technology governance, which is really hard. So thank you all so much for your insights today. And thank you, audience, for your questions. And any feedback you can give us on our data governance indicators, we would be so grateful. Have a great week, everybody. Thank you for coming. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.